mall. A racist cop beats up an elderly black woman, but when her son arrives, their faces go nothing but fear. Find out what happens. Then imagine, you're in a mall going about your business, and you are suddenly accused of something you didn't do. That's exactly what happened to Mrs. Ruby, an elderly woman who was harassed by security guards, but he didn't know her son was about to show up. What happened next has left everyone stunned. Stay tuned to find out how this dramatic story unfolds. Before you start this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love to hear from viewers all over the world. It was a peaceful afternoon at the mall. Mrs. Ruby Jenkins, a woman, black, kind, and elderly, spent her time shopping. The usual 70-year-old fan with soft gray hair and calm and soothing presence, always carried herself gracefully, even when her body wasn't moving as fast as before Madam's can. Ruby clicked rhythmically on the tiles as she made her way through the aisles, her sweet smile lighting up her face. Her shopping session was almost over, and her bags were filled with simple items: bread, vegetables, milk, and her favorites. She walked carefully, her legs feeling a little tired despite her age, as she still tried to stay as independent as possible, preferring to shop alone. As she neared the exit, her paces slowed. She took a deep breath, enjoying the quiet moment before suddenly heading home. Two security officers, dressed in uniform, dark and stern, flocked her way. Tall had towered over her, their faces showing a cold and suspicious look. Mrs. Ruby, surprised, looked at them with wide eyes. "Mrs. "We need to talk to you," said one of the officers in a low, accusatory voice. He crossed his arms as he stood in front of her, making it clear that he was not going to let her pass. Mrs. Ruby blinked, confused. "Something is wrong?" she asked softly. Her heart started to beat a little faster. "We have received reports that you were shoplifting," the other officer added abruptly, his sheer almost as if he had already decided she was guilty. Mrs. Ruby's smile faded. The accusation stung him, making his heart even faster. Her fingers gripped the handle of her cane a little tighter. "No, sir," she said in a slightly shaky voice. "I paid for all my stuff." She reached into her bag, trying to pull out a receipt. Their hands were shaking with nervousness. She found it and held it up in the air, but the officers hadn't even bothered to look at it. "We need you to come with us," the first officer said firmly, ignoring her attempt to show them she had nothing wrong. Miss Ruby felt her stomach in knots. Her mind was racing, trying to figure out what was going on. Why didn't he just check her receipt and let her go? She had always been so careful, always doing everything the right way. Why did he treat her like that? "But I didn't steal anything," she tried to explain again, her voice shaking more. Now, as she felt the panic rising in her chest, he didn't listen without warning. One of the officers reached out and grabbed her arm. The sudden grip made her flinch, and she nearly dropped her cane. "Let go," he said as he pulled her towards the back of the store. Mrs. Ruby felt her heart pounding in her ears. She couldn't believe this was happening. She tried to free her arm, but the officer's point was too strong. "Please," begged she. "I didn't do anything wrong." But the officers didn't care. They pulled her harder, and pain shot through her tired body. She looked at the mall, hoping someone would come to her aid. The people were watching, but no one moved. He stood there whispering and giving each other judgmental glances. Mrs. Ruby felt completely alone. Tears welled up her eyes. She had never been in trouble before, had never even raised her voice in front of anyone. And now she was being dragged through the mall, like a criminal. It was humiliating. It was terrifying her. Her breathing was becoming shallow, and her vision was blurring as she began to fall onto her purse, which was sagging. Her arm in the struggle, her phone fell and hit the floor with a thud. The policeman continued to dragging towards the back room without even noticing, but Mrs. Ruby noticed her heart had skipped a beat. Her son Oliver, her strong and brave son, had told her to call if she ever needed help, and she needed him more than ever. Hands shaking, she reached out and grabbed the phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to unlock it. The police were pulling her, but she managed to press the call button to dial her son's number. The phone rang once, then twice. Finally a click. "Mom." Oliver's deep voice came through the line. Mrs. Ruby's voice was shaking as she whispered into the phone, tears now streaming down her face. "Oliver, please come, they're hurting me. I don't know what to do." She could barely express the words, but Oliver understood. "I'm coming, Mom, wait." He arrived at the mall a few minutes later, his thumb speeding up. As she hastily parked, he walked inside, scanning the area, until he spotted her. His mother was being jostled by two security guards near the back of a store. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. His mother looked small and fragile between the two burly men, her face stretch of Tears, they had their hands on her, grabbing her arms and dragging her to a dirty back, like she was a criminal, his heart beating with a mixture of rage and sorrow. His sweet mother, who had never hurt anyone, was treated like this, a fire lit in his chest. But he knew he had to stay calm. Oliver took a deep breath to steady himself. He couldn't let this emotion take over, had been trained for high-pressure situations. And this one was no different, but deep down his heart was screaming as she walked towards them. His eyes never leaving the officers, his steps firm, his pose tight. At this sight, Oliver could feel his blood boiling, but his face remained stone cold. His mother's safety was all that mattered. Now, Mom, his voice was deep and controlled, even though it took everything for it to stay that way. Mrs. Ruby, though clearly shaken, looked up at the sound of her son's voice, his eyes close to the gun, his quirks in relief. Oliver, she whispered, her voice cracking. Captain Johnson walks towards the officer, his chest rising and falling at every breath. His mere presence seemed to draw the attention of the crowd gathered nearby, but the security officers didn't seem to notice or care. "It's none of your business, sir," said one of the officers as she briefly looked at Oliver, thinking clearly he was just another disgruntled spectator. "Back off, where we will have to act." Oliver clenched his jaw, trying to contain the anger that was brewing just beneath the surface. His dark eyes narrowed as she stared directly at the officer. "It's my business. It's my mother." The officer blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the authority in Oliver's way. But instead of backing off, the officer tightened his grip on Mrs. Ruby's arm almost to prove a weight. Oliver's hands closed in weight. At his side, he wanted to knock the man's hand off his mother, but he kept this cool. "That's right. Your mother," scoffed the other officer, "no matter, she suspected of theft. And we're taking her to the back to handle it now, unless you want to get involved in this mess. I suggest you leave." Oliver felt the fire in his chest roar even louder, but he kept his voice calm. "She hasn't done anything wrong. You can check their seat in her bag. But before you do anything else, you need to let go of her." The officers exchanged an increasingly defensive look. The first officer took a step towards Oliver, puffing out his chest, clearly having no idea who he was dealing with. "You need to back off. Now, sir, we'll have to call the police." Oliver is almost as mild at the absurdity of the situation. "Call the police." "Has to go ahead." The officer hesitated, not knowing how to react to Oliver's calm confidence. Instead of backing off, he tried to redouble his efforts to intimidate Oliver into leaving. "I don't think you understand how serious this is. If you intervene, we'll also arrest him." Oliver's eyes, his pity, and so was about to be exhausted here, etched into his jacket, pulled out his badge and held it up for the officers to see. "I'm Captain Oliver Johnson of the 15th Precinct," he said in a deadly voice. "Let go of my mother." The two officers froze, their eyes widened in shock. It was as if the ground had fallen underneath them. They stuttered as they stumbled on their words, their faces growing sweet as they processed what had just happened. This wasn't just a random man, this was a police captain. A man who ranked everyone he could call captain, stammered one of the officers. Released Mrs. Ruby's arm. "We didn't know, sir. We were just following orders." Oliver stepped closer, towering over the officers. Now that his mother was safe, the anger he had kept at bay was simmering just below the surface. He stared at Thiemann with a look enough to cut through them. "Like stone, you didn't know that?" Oliver repeated, his voice is soft but dangerous. "You didn't think to ask? Didn't you think to check their seat, to listen to her or treat her with respect?" The officers were speechless. One of them tried to stammer an apology, but Oliver ground him with a hard stare. "What if it was your mother?" asked, his voice tight with emotion. "If it was her being treated like a criminal, humiliated in front of strangers, would you still be so ready to put your hands on her?" The officers' face flushed, their eyes widened with fear and regret. They had no answer. They had been wrong, and they knew it. Oliver turned to his mother, his expressions of tender. She gently took her hand. "Are you okay, Mommy?" Miss Ruby still shaking her head. "Chaz lowly, I'm okay." "Oliver," she whispered, her voice trembling. Oliver squeezed her hand reassuringly, then turned back to the officers. "You'll hear about internal affairs," she said coldly, "out of my sight." Without another word, the police stepped back, his head bowed high. Oliver wrapped his arm around his mother's shoulders, led her out of the store. His heart was still beating in his chest, but his mother was safe, and that was all that mattered. Mrs. Ruby held Oliver's arm tight, his body still shaking with fear and humiliation. She looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, son," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. The weight of the moment hit Oliver hard. His heart ached for his mother. She had always been so strong, so proud, and having treated him this way filled him with a deep sorrow. As Oliver and Mrs. Ruby left the mall, the weight of the ordeal still hung in the air, but a feeling of satisfaction. The officers would be held accountable for their actions, and justice would be served. Even though Mrs. Ruby Sharp was still aching from the evil she had endured, she knew one thing for sure. Her son, brave and loyal, had made things right. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more captivating stories like this one, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss our next story. Join our community and stay tuned for more amazing content. If this story touched you, subscribe for more inspiring reads. Leave a comment with your thoughts and don't forget to like the video to support us. See you soon.